First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, ACOM and UNICEF, for having me here today. I think it's very important that the media, and I'm not talking about just the press, the media have a clear line of communication actually with the ministries, not just my ministry, but all ministries. And the reason for that is I think that the government has a lot more credibility and tends to be a lot more responsible when they know that the next phone call or the next knock on the door might be a familiar face. And I think that cultivating these relationships is critical to making sure that the flow of information is as complete as possible, as unrestricted as possible. Okay. The title of the presentation that I've been given is a bit restrictive, and I want to expand it slightly and talk about adaptation and mitigation. I'll talk about my carbon later on, but talk about adaptation and mitigation as reflected in the relationship between media and the political stakeholders, as it were. And even though at the ministry level we do things as a matter of national policy, we guide the country, at the same time also we have a responsibility to represent the country internationally and hold other countries, other parties accountable, not just for their actions, but also for what they've agreed to do. Okay, we're working in the context of a convention, we're working in the context of a protocol that's in force. Are you doing what you have agreed to do? All right. But first, I'll begin with a little bit of a primer on the greenhouse effect. Mr. Govind has started that, but I'll do a little bit more. A little bit about managing the climate narrative, and I have an example on that. Talk very briefly on the national policy for climate change. A little bit about adaptation and its cost, because I noticed that there's a lot of stuff here on water, and then Prof. Joy will be coming later on. I think you have a very, very in-depth presentation by Prof. Joy on adaptation. Mitigation and its implementation, and then I'll move into my carbon. But before I end, I'd like to go back again to how the narrative is being shaped, even in the science. Because one of the first things we've agreed is that this convention is going to be a science-based convention. Okay? So then he who can shape what the science finds can then shape the entire convention and everything that goes with it. All right. This is the example that Mr. Grumit had, a very similar one. This one is just animated, so it's marginally more sophisticated. But it's also very wrong. Okay? So when you have more greenhouse gases, it's usually drawn as a layer or a wall or a divider that reflect more of the infrared radiation back to the Earth, then you have the greenhouse effect. Okay? And the greenhouse effect is necessary because without the greenhouse effect, we bake in the day and we freeze at night, and we wouldn't have the stable temperatures that we do. So greenhouse gases are very, very important for life on Earth. But when you have too much of them, then you have too much of a good thing. Now, it's a cartoon, it's very, very big, but the problem is that it's wrong because the actual layer is only about the thickness of the brown layer. Now this is a photograph of the space shuttle taken from the International Space Station. The brown layer is the troposphere. That is where the weather occurs in the world, in the troposphere. It's 8 kilometers thick at the poles, it's 18 kilometers thick at the equator, because if you think of a boiling pot of water, even if you look at the pot of water, it boils up in the middle and such. So it's thicker at the equator and it gets thinner and thinner at the poles. Above that white layer is the stratosphere. That's where the jet streams live. So there's little vertical movement there. It's all horizontal. So the heat energy is picked up from the troposphere, given to the stratosphere, moves in the jet streams to the cooler parts of the world, and everything above that is the mesosphere and the thermosphere. All right. So the space shuttle really isn't at the border between the stratosphere and the mesosphere. It's just the angle at which the picture is taken, because the space station is further up. Okay, the shuttle is actually way up in the thermosphere. All right. Now that entire blue layer the thermosphere all the way out to where it became black. That is this thin layer shown in green, 50 kilometers up. Okay, so the area over which, or through which the heat has to be transferred from the places that are hot, that is the equator, to the poles, that are places that are cold, is extremely thin. And that's why it takes so long, and in the process it's so turbulent. All right, people are wondering why typhoons in the Pacific used to track at the level of Taiwan, now they track at the level of the Philippines. Because it took that distance of accumulating thermal energy to form a typhoon. So they used to form further north. But when you have more heat, then you can accumulate the same amount of heat in a shorter distance. So you'll see that with changing climate, typhoons are tracking closer and closer to the equator. And I'm saying the day that a typhoon crosses the equator or forms at the equator, we are really in big trouble. Okay? This is a photograph from a space shuttle, from the International Space Station. It's a very cool photograph because there is a shooting star right there. I'm a bit of a space buff. Anyway, now I want to talk about how the climate narrative is being shaped in the media. All right, or actually what the narrative is like. Now this is an excerpt from Hillary Clinton's, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's book called Hard Choices. Okay, it's the title of the book, Hard Choices. And this particular section, and I've picked the pertinent parts out. Do we have a pointer? Does the pointer work? If the slide changer doesn't work, at least hopefully the pointer works. Okay. This is how she portrays what happened in Copenhagen during the 15th Conference of Parties. Okay, President Obama, we were looking for Premier Wen because we knew that China would be a key, but the Chinese were avoiding us. And then we learned they were having a secret meeting with these people, all right? And we knew something was amiss. So we sent out our spies, and we discovered that the meeting's location, and this is the nice part, are you thinking what I'm thinking? After exchanging looks of, are you thinking what I'm thinking? We set off, charging up a flight of stairs, encountering surprised Chinese officials. In the commotion, the president slipped through the door and yelled, "Mr. Premier," which got everyone's attention. Okay? And then this is how the meeting room is described. In a makeshift conference room whose glass walls had been covered by drapes for privacy against prying eyes, we found the Premier, surrounded by Minister Marmohan, Brazilian President, South African President. Jaws dropped when they saw us. "Are you ready?" said President Obama, with a big grin. Now the real negotiations could begin. It was a moment that was at least a year in the making. Now this is media, this is print. This is a book, okay? And it's State Secretary Hillary Clinton's recollection or accounting of what happened, or her account of what happened. Yeah, Secretary of State, yeah. Actually, this is very interesting because what they did was they crashed a meeting of the basic group. Okay, the year before, 1 year before, in 2014, the basic group, or the basic, it's a coalition, was formed with China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And a coalition under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has every right to have a meeting room and to have a meeting. Okay, but the interesting way in which the event is portrayed in her book is like there were secret meetings, and if we hadn't busted open the secret meeting, nothing would have moved. But as it turned out, nothing moved anyway, because when President Obama went into the press conference and said, "We have a deal," we really didn't have a deal. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a bit about national climate change policy. And we have a national national policy on climate change. It's a very general policy because we realize specific, especially that the actions have to take place on the ground, in corporate entities, in people's lives, in housing estates, in schools, etc., for this to really happen. And the best way to do this is to have a very general policy, but to actually have very detailed action plans and strategies that can come along later. Okay, and the National Adaptation Plan is one of them. Professor will probably talk about that maybe a little bit, if not I will. All right, so we've got national policies, policy review, we've got roadmaps and strategies, then these come down to action plans, and then we finally get regulations and or legislation. These cover adaptation because this is the part of climate change that you do not have a choice about. Change is already happening. If you don't adapt, you're done. Okay? These overlap sometimes with mitigation. So you can take adaptation actions that also have mitigation effects, or you could have mitigation actions that are only mitigation actions, and these will reduce your future adaptation needs. Okay? But what I want you to bear in mind is that you have a finite national budget. Alright? And so the more you spend on this part, then the less you have to spend on this part. And the interesting thing is that with the advent of climate change, we are now having to spend more on this part that we previously had to spend on things like education, things like poverty eradication, things like vocational training, things like for example, even aid or even development for rural areas, for example. Okay, rural education. Okay, so with increasing pressure from climate change, from extreme weather events, more and more is needing to be spent here, and I'll talk a little about that later. Now, this happens within the context of those are the national things, but these things now take place in the context of the international governance frameworks, such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Right? So this is Philippines. This is Thailand. This is Philippines, and this is Malaysia. You've seen the impacts of changing climate, and what we have to worry about is we have to worry about the vulnerable industries. Okay, agroforestry, certainly agricultural crops already mentioned. Transportation is impacted by severe storms and floods. Mining sectors, mines can be flooded out. Construction industries, work cannot go on when there's extreme weather. Manufacturing relies a lot on transportation. You don't have raw materials coming in, you don't have your finished products going out, you're stuck. Tourism is very interesting because if we have year after year after year dry periods with the haze, no one will want to come. And eventually oil and gas is also important because many oil and gas installations are offshore. And so weather clearly plays a role there, offloading, onloading, etc. All right? And what we know about climate change is, and this is a bit of a dated slide, but what we expect in terms of increasing levels of temperature are already quite clear. What people don't seem to understand is that these are all just averages. Okay? And an increase of 2 degrees average may mean an increase of only 1 degree in the equator, but it may mean 5 or 6 degrees in the poles. All right? And anywhere in between it could be different. And people are talking about, why are we having such severe winters in the northern hemisphere when we're supposed to be encountering global warming? It's because the interference with the global climate systems means that phenomena such as the circumpolar current, which would normally trap cold air in the North Pole, begin to weaken, and that cold air begins to spill out the bottom and to chill parts of Europe and North America and Canada. All right? But in doing so, it invites warm air to come in from the top and enter the polar areas as well. So this exacerbation, I mean, the fact that you're feeling cold in Scandinavia and Europe doesn't mean that the pole is colder. It means that the pole is losing heat, losing cold air to you and is gaining warm air from the top. All right. Next. All right. So what we're worrying about when we're talking about adaptation is we really want to minimize property damage. That's the first thing. We also want to ensure uninterrupted food, water, and critical services, including energy, but also public services. And we normally do this as part of our national 5-year development plans. We look at other policies, such as the water policy, okay, the food policy, and we try and work within those and incorporate any new changes that may be necessary as a result of climate change. But these 5-year plans also give us a chance to change the nature of our policies and focus very specifically on climate change. So in terms of the 11th Malaysia Plan, what we're looking at is a National Adaptation Plan, or a NAP. And this involves assessment of climate change risks, addressing water security and sufficiency, food security and sufficiency, energy, protecting resources, and reducing climate change impacts to natural ecosystems, and very importantly, livelihoods associated with natural ecosystems. Okay? So not only do we need to make sure that in parts of the country that generate GDP, livelihoods are not impacted. We need to worry about livelihoods everywhere. All right. Adaptation, however, is expensive, and that's why I mentioned to you that the finite national budget, bigger and bigger proportions are going to adaptation. Annual flood loss in Malaysia, 1 to 3 billion ringgit. In 1971, flood cost 200 million. In 2006-2007, it was already 1.5 billion. Okay? So as we continue to develop, without adaptation, we put more and more of our development infrastructure at risk. Okay? So then it becomes a true dilemma. Do you use that finite national budget for adaptation, or do you use it for development? You need development. Okay, so now you need climate resilient or climate friendly development. So you need to make sure that your development is consistent with anticipated changes in the climate. Okay? In the last 10 years, all our flood mitigation projects total 6.7 billion ringgit. And that value, I can bet you, is going to go up in the coming years. All right? Finally, for protecting coastal cities, we've already done several studies, and this is not just the impact of floods coming from the land, but also high tides due to sea level rise. It's going to be in the tens to hundreds of millions, possibly tens of billions. Right? So once again, these issues, once in a while I'll get a call from the Treasury or Ministry of Finance, and they'll say, what is our role in this? And I'll try to tell them, well, what is your budget now? And how do you see your budget in 10 years' time? Okay? And then let's sit down and talk about it. And then they're shocked. They're shocked. They say, we can't afford this. I say, yes, you can't. You're right. You're absolutely right. So where can you get that extra money from? What are you spending it on now? Okay? And straight away, I say to them, how much are you spending, for example, for gas imports from Kuwait? Wouldn't you like to not have to do that? And that leads me to the next part of my talk, which is mitigation. Okay? But as I said earlier, adaptation is non-optional, and it is obligated as a result of, as was mentioned earlier, not necessarily our emissions, but emissions from developed countries since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, having said that, Malaysia, without access to new technologies, is on the same development path that just follows. Alright, we learn from the best. Now, if the bestest is beyond us, then we will just use the best practices. Okay? What we want is optimal practices. What we want is optimal lifestyles. We want optimal use of resources, management of resources, conservation of resources. We want to optimize these things. So in fact, in this 11th Malaysia Plan, we're looking not just at sustainable resource use, but the broader approach of sustainable resource management, which includes conservation as well. Why use natural gas resources when we could conserve them and lengthen the natural lifetime? You don't just use natural gas for energy, You use natural gas as a feedstock for fertilizers. How sustainable is that? Don't we want to have natural gas feedstocks 30, 50, 100 years from now? Okay? Alright. Well, before I get into mitigation, where are we in terms of Malaysia's emissions from greenhouse gases? Well, we're not in the top, what is this, the top 20 or top 20? We're not in the top 20 in terms of total emissions because we're just too small of a country. Alright? I don't think we're in the top 20 in terms of per capita either, but I think we are around rank 30 in absolute terms and in per capita terms, we're ranked 51. Okay? All the countries in the world, 200 and some more countries. No. And we're moving up the ranks. Let's be straight about that. We do have the good fortune to have petroleum resources, and we are moving up the ranks because perhaps we need to learn how to use our petroleum resources more efficiently. These are our emissions from the energy sector, as you can see. As a function of all these things, transport, agriculture, etc., we're growing. And we want to change that. So as part of the proceedings of the 15th Conference of Parties in Copenhagen, and this is the same one that Hillary was at, but she saw it a bit differently, or she remembered it differently, we have announced, not on paper, but we've announced a voluntary reduction in emissions intensity of GDP up to 40% by 2020 compared to 2005. But this is the important part: conditional on receiving transfer of technology and finance of adequate levels and effective levels from the developed countries. All right. Now, sounds like a cop-out, right? But I'll go into that. And then we also pledged. We actually renewed a pledge that was taken at the original Rio Summit, Earth Summit in 1992, where we said we would keep at least 50% of our land area under forests. Now, why did we choose the emissions intensity of GDP? This is a graph that shows the growth in GDP for Denmark, and this is the emissions. Notice that the two are decoupled. They're not linked. Whereas in Malaysia, they are linked. In fact, emissions are growing faster than GDP. All right? So the intensity is a good measure if what you are trying to do is to establish or to get people to understand the strong relationship between GDP and emissions, and actually try to find ways to decouple them. And there are many ways to decouple them. Right? Just to let you know where we are, 1994, 2000, and 2005. These are the total emissions. Okay, millions of tons of CO2. And then when you combine them with GDP, this is the intensity you get. All right? So you will find that intensity is increasing, but as time goes on, naturally, quite naturally, intensities will tend to decrease because we tend to become more efficient in terms of our technology use. Okay? Every new computer that comes out with a lower voltage processor. Every phone that comes out works on a smaller battery, a more efficient battery, etc. So it's going to decrease, but we need to decrease it 40% below this amount here. Okay, that's why 2005 is the reference year level. Now, going to why we made that announcement. Okay, the reason is that we wanted to be consistent with all the decisions, principles, and procedures and annexes of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. At the 15th Conference of Parties, we were supposed to agree to the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And one of those aspects of the Kyoto Protocol was the Bali Action Plan, which meant that developing countries would announce their nationally appropriate mitigation actions. Now, the convention is very straightforward. Article 1 is definitions, Article 2 is the objective, Article 3 is the principles, and Article 4 is the commitments. Article 4.1 is everybody's commitments. Article 4.2 is the commitments of developed countries. And Article 4.2 is very important because developed countries who have signed and ratified the convention have commitments A, to reduce their own emissions, and B, to assist developing countries to reduce theirs. Now, what is the level of bindingness between the developed and developing countries in terms of the second one, in terms of B? Well, you just have to look to Article 4.7. And Article 4.7 says, the extent to which developing country parties will implement their commitments will depend on the implementation by developed country parties of their commitments. to provide financial resources and transfer technology. This is the level of bindingness between developed and developing countries in terms of the ability of developing countries to reduce their emissions. Now, this is what is affirmed in the PM's announcement, because the emissions reduction is conditional on transfer of technology and finance from developed countries. Okay, now we said 40%, by now we've achieved about 33 odd percent. We seem to be on target to achieve the 40% by 2020, but we have not received finance or technology transfer for emissions reductions. Malaysians are paying for their own mitigation actions. You are paying feed-in tariff, okay? You are paying to subsidize compressed natural gas and the B5 diesel program, okay? You are subsidizing the rebates for your efficient appliances, okay? All these things, Malaysians and the Malaysian taxpayer through the government are paying for this. And we want to make this clear at the upcoming New York summit, okay? But this is also the other part of Article 4.7. Taking into account that economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties, which means if you want Malaysia to behave like a Denmark or a Sweden, then you have to provide the means of implementation for Malaysia to develop along the same lines and in fact leapfrog all the dirty technologies and get to the clean technologies and behaviors and lifestyles that are in place there, right? And the sooner this happens, the sooner we will achieve this. For example, the sooner my neighbor stops putting in air conditioning, the sooner the outside will be cooler. Okay, and the sooner then I'll spend more time outside, I'll spend more time with my car windows down instead of up, and so on and so on. The spiral either goes up or it goes down. Alright? And if we stay on this development track, then the spiral will continue to go down. Alright. Now, what is emissions intensity of GDP? Very simple. You take the emissions, you divide it by GDP. If you have this situation where both are rising, or where emissions are rising faster than GDP, you've got a positive slope. If they're parallel, you've got a constant intensity. And if they are moving in opposite directions in terms of the GDP and the emissions, or the GDP is growing faster than the emissions, then we will have decreasing intensity. It's very simple. All right? So we want to achieve the 40%. We can do it either by increasing the GDP, or you can do it by decreasing the emissions. All right. So what do we have? We've got a business as usual scenario. Okay, 2005 is right here. 2020 is over here. Here we are now, 2013, 2014. But the business as usual scenario has some variation. We don't know what the GDP will be. Will it be more than we expect? Will it be less than we expect? EPU is giving us a lot of help with this. We've got the 40% intensity reduction indicator that's pegged to the intensity in 2015. All right? But what we've also learned is that there are many ways to calculate this. It depends what you take into account and what you leave out of the equation. So you can have values above or below it, which gives us a suite of possibilities as we approach 2020 that we have to consider. First of all, it may be the nominal case. We need to reduce this amount of intensity, which, if we assume a level of GDP, then gives us X number of tons of CO2 that we need to reduce. In the case of the nominal case here, it's about 63 million tons that we'll need to cut from our emissions inventory, okay, from the greenhouse gas inventory. We could also have a best case scenario where we only have to do between here and here, but conversely, we also have a worst case scenario. If the BAU is exceptionally high, okay, and we have a method of calculation, then we'll actually have a lot of emissions reductions, possibly way more than 63 million tons. This is where we are right about now, and this is where we hope to be. Okay? Once again, we are doing this on our own dime. Okay. I need to talk about a little bit about nationally appropriate mitigation actions. I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this, But I think it's necessary because we need to understand that Malaysia is still in a phase where emissions reductions are voluntary for Malaysia. What we're doing is all voluntary. We're taking action where developed countries are now actually resisting action. Okay, not all developed countries obviously, but some clearly so. Alright? Australia just repealed their carbon tax. Okay? When they did so, of course you would expect countries would be dismayed. Canada applauded. Congratulated Australia. Strange. At least the EU came out with a very scathing message on that regard. Okay? So all these things should actually be determined by the country, and the focus is on transparency. So developing countries want to show or need to show under the present regime, in the present state of the convention, that we are being transparent about. And actually, if you look at it, something like, for example, our subsidies for fossil fuels, we've been very transparent about that at the international level. Everyone knows how much we subsidize fossil fuels. We put it on our pumps at the petrol stations. And this makes us a target, because they don't know how much, for example, Kuwait is subsidizing the fossil fuels. All right? So transparency is good, but transparency is not enough. And the reason for that is that, at least under the Kyoto Protocol and what we hope will be a top-down compliance-based system, countries really need to have emissions reductions targets. And the taking up of these targets actually is up to developed countries, because they are, under the convention, required to take the lead in addressing climate change, which means also leading in terms of mitigation. But what we have in terms of the upcoming 2015 agreement is a situation where the water is very, very muddy. We have developed countries wanting to step back from a compliance mechanism into a transparency mechanism. At first they called it pledge and review. But what the US is beginning to talk about is pledge and no review. We pledge, like it or not, that's our pledge. Low, high, like it or lump it. Alright? At the same time, they want to put developing countries, pull them out of a transparency regime and put them under a compliance regime. And I don't believe that's fair. Okay. So, I really don't want to go into this too much, because I think it takes too much time. The business as usual scenario, these things are all quite technical in nature. A methodology, you define a business as usual scenario, you compile your activity data and your emissions factors. And an emissions reduction is actually the activity data, such as tons of B5 used, calculated using the relevant emissions factors, and then you get the emissions reduction. Okay, so you do it once for the BAU scenario, you repeat it for the mitigation scenario, and the difference is your emissions reduction. Okay? Alright. I have one example. B5 diesel use, you have a business as usual scenario, which is 100% fossil diesel. And then you have a mitigation scenario, which is 95% diesel with 5% biodiesel. You compare the energy content of biodiesel versus, not biodiesel, but B5 diesel, which is the combination, versus fossil diesel. And then using the activity data, which is the amount of B5 sold, and the emissions factors, you then calculate the reduction in emissions. So where are we looking for all these emissions reductions? We're looking everywhere that we can. Energy efficiency measures, in government buildings, in the corporate sector, in schools, etc. We're looking at replacing fossil fuels wherever possible. All right. We're looking at avoiding methane, both from waste as well as from agriculture. And then we're looking at sequestering carbon dioxide, both in forests as well as in other materials, forest-derived materials. Now, I'll talk a little bit about geologic reservoirs at the end of this talk. But as Mr. Gurmit said, in all of these things, there are vested interests. And many times it's the vested interests that hold up, undermine, obstruct, delay, okay, the adoption of all these. Okay, when you go to China, China is a country that's often vilified, all right? But when you go there and look at how the people there live, the first thing you realize is in many ways, Chinese are much more efficient than Malaysians. They all have very low-cost solar water heaters on their roofs. Okay? And why don't we have those here? I apologize to those who have heard this before. We still look to the West. We still have a colonial mentality. If we want to have a solar water heater, it has to be Danish technology, a German technology, something with vacuum tubes, vacuum between the inner tube that has the water and the outer tube, so that the sun can go in but the heat can't come out. All right, we don't need that level of efficiency. Those were designed for places where the sun is low on the horizon, is visible 4 hours a day, and the air temperature is -10. All right, we've got sun all day, and the air temperature is almost 30. Right. So what is the result of this mismatch between technology and lifestyle? Children have gotten scalded because the maids don't realize how hot the water is, because the technology is completely inappropriate and it costs way too much. Okay, but if I were a storekeeper and I can make a huge margin by selling one Danish water heater versus selling 10 locally built or imported Chinese water heaters, then what am I going to do? Do I have all that space? Space is a premium. I'm going to sell one. Okay, so we need to change some of the ideas that are floating around about what is the best for Malaysia and where we need to get started. We need to move where it is possible to move, rather than hoping that one day the government will have a huge subsidy for a loan on a very highly efficient water heater. All right. Now, I want to change gears now and talk about MyCarbon, because MyCarbon is an initiative by my ministry, and it's essentially a corporate greenhouse gas reporting program. It's a voluntary program for now, but we believe it's necessary because unless you begin looking at things bottom up, you will never be able to analyze where your inefficiencies are, where your emissions are, and so you will have a very difficult time accounting for things that are currently externalities. Okay, many businesses externalize many parts of the business that may not be relevant to the bottom line, or they believe is not relevant to the bottom line. They buy the lowest cost inputs, they produce things as cheaply as possible and try to sell them as expensively as possible, or move them out as quickly as possible, without realizing that sometimes you may actually have a flaw where you don't realize that you're actually less than efficient. You might have to spend more, for example, on inputs, but then again, if you spend it on the right kind of inputs, you may be able to entirely eliminate your waste stream, for example. So your entire cost for waste management might disappear. If you don't open yourself out to the idea that this is even possible, you'll never move in that direction. So you always think, okay, this is my waste management budget, and I'm spending the lowest cost on inputs. That's it. But what we want to do is for companies to begin internalizing all these externalities, and particularly externalities related to environment. Okay? So these are the objectives. We also want to measure achievement of preparing Malaysia for international compliance standards, because we see this moving to a compliance system. Because now, if you think of the 2015 agreement, that agreement is to be agreed in 2015, but it comes into force in 2020, which means from 2020 onward we'll be in a compliance state. Now, whether we have obligations to report actions, or whether we have obligations to report emissions reductions targets, we don't know yet, because that's under negotiation. All right, but we will be under some kind of compliance mechanism, and to do this, we actually have RMK11, which spans the period from 2016 to 2020. So during the RMK11 is when we will actually begin to prepare the country for being under a greenhouse gas compliance mechanism post 2020. Right? So why would any corporate entity want to do this? And we were quite surprised, because corporate entities wanted to do it. We had recognition for early involuntary action, public reporting, managing risks, participating in programs, and the potential of participating in markets. I'll talk a bit about markets later, because there's this big difference between national level subnational markets and international markets. All right, but we do have several schemes for standardizing reporting by companies. What we're using is this, the greenhouse gas protocol. It's very simple. Okay, in a few days, an entity like even my ministry can pull up a greenhouse gas report. Okay, the ISO is more complicated, but the greenhouse gas protocol is designed to take input from this. So if you're already doing this, if you're an AirAsia or someone else doing this, then very easily do those numbers get it imported into there. This is the framework based on the fact that the ministry is the focal point. All right. What we do is we provide the tools. The focal point provides the tools for corporate entities to calculate and then report their emissions reductions. But very importantly, what we also need is a plan. So apart from knowing what your carbon footprint is, your corporate entity also has to look at your overall carbon budget and then begin thinking about how you can plan to reduce it. Now, they have a subnational market mechanism in China. It is done at the city level. Okay? And the credits between cities are not allowed. It's only movement within of credits within each city. Okay, Beijing, of course, is one of them. All right? But the first thing they did was to get companies to look at their own carbon footprints over the last 5 years, and then they would issue them for the coming year. Let's say the company's emissions were 100,000 tons, right? So next year we'll give you 95,000 credits, right? And if you think you can reduce below 95,000, then you have extra credits to sell. But if you think next year is going to be a hard year, I'm going to wait till the price is cheap and buy credits on the market. Now, the Chinese are doing this because they perceive that businesses don't like regulations. They prefer a system where they can actually be incentivized to actually determine their own destiny, as it were. All right? And most of these companies actually have subsidiaries that are not in the business of emission, but just in the mission of providing financial services. And many times they will sell these credits directly to their management entities at a very high discount. And then you'll have trades between my company's finance branch and your company's finance branch, and we'll sort it all out that way. Okay? But what exists is a punitive system. If you either don't make your target, you have to go out and buy, or you don't report. And in fact, the punishment for not reporting is higher than the punishment for not making your target. Okay? So it's facilitative in nature rather than punitive in nature. Alright, so we have management audit providers, management service providers, and the idea is to assist you, but ultimately the idea is actually to have SEM, the small to medium enterprises be able to do this themselves. Okay. Very briefly, this is what it is. This is a voluntary stage. Involves the 6 gases under the Kyoto Protocol, and other IPCC gases are optional. We'll begin to look at some of the details. We have Scope 1, which is direct emissions, purchased energy, which is Scope 2. I'm not emitting it myself, but I'm buying it from someone who is emitting. And Scope 3 is all other indirect emissions. Now, how is this different? How this is different from the top-down national greenhouse gas inventory is important, because the objective of the national greenhouse gas inventory is to actually determine the emissions of the country, whereas what this is designed to do is to actually look bottom up at how you can manage emissions from these various emission sources in your corporate sector. This cannot simply be added up and then expect to produce the national greenhouse gas inventory, simply because my Scope 2 is somebody else's Scope 1. Okay? If I'm buying electricity from Tenaga, I'm not emitting that, but I'm reporting it as Scope 2. But Tenaga National is reporting this as Scope 1. So it should actually is double counting. Alright? But the objective of this is very different from the objective of the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. These are the thresholds at which you actually begin to participate when the system becomes mandatory. The China threshold is 100,000 tons. You are under a compliance mechanism if you emit 100,000 tons or more. We have two documents out available online on My Carbon. And before I move any further, I want to talk a little bit about international market mechanisms, because the moment companies hear about carbon footprinting, they think, okay, I'm going to reduce my emissions, I'm going to generate credits, and I'm going to put these credits up for sale on the market. Well, the market is in a shambles, simply because there's way too much supply and way too little demand. And it's like that because on the demand side, there is no ambition from developed countries. No ambition means no demand for credits. All right? And the high supply on the part of developing countries actually points to the fact that developing countries are undertaking emissions reductions at a much higher rate than developed countries. Okay? That's why we're awash with carbon credits. In fact, one of the estimates is that we'll be awash until 2025. Okay, so if you're thinking of going into the greenhouse gas credits market, you might want to think about it more. Okay, this is a bit of background on what was actually a flexible mechanism for developed countries to assist them to meet their targets became a market mechanism. It was just a flexibility mechanism at first. Okay, and it was to help developed countries avoid punitive carryover. If you didn't achieve your target originally, whatever you had left over that you didn't achieve, you had to carry 1/3 of that value over as well, in addition to that value to the next commitment period, and you'd have more emissions reductions to comply with. But we were very nice, developing countries said, okay, if you buy credits on the market and get rid of that debt, then you won't have to carry a punitive surplus over, right? But the moment credits became fungible, the EU put up the EU emissions trading scheme. And that allowed speculators to come in and buy credits up and begin manipulating the price. Okay. And now, I highlighted a little bit about geologic storage of fossil fuels. Of greenhouse gases. And I'm very, very concerned about this for several reasons. Okay? One, carbon capture and storage, or CCS, being promoted by fuel exporters as a means of countering reduced demand for fossil fuels. Okay? This is something known as adverse impacts of response measures. As an oil exporter, if your response measure to climate change is to cut use of fossil fuels, my exports are going to drop. All right? That's an adverse impact for me. I'm adversely impacted by your response measure to climate change. So I can push this idea and say, my fossil fuels are not that troublesome if you were to take the exhaust and pump it underground. Okay? You transport it to a certified reservoir, you pressurize it, you inject it, and you monitor it forever. Now, in terms of who's liable for this, okay, liability and permanence, the person who is going to certify your reservoir, you're going to pay him to do it. You're going to pay this person to do an analysis and tell you this reservoir has good integrity, it is good for 500 years. All right? And then this person is going to inject your greenhouse gases down into this reservoir, and then they're going to monitor it, but just for a little while. After 5 years, it goes back to the country. So, if it leaks, whose problem is it? It's your problem. It's Malaysia's problem. And what happens if this reservoir is, for example, in international waters? Then whose responsibility is it? What happens if I inject it on my side of in territorial waters, but the leak occurs in international waters? Then whose responsibility is it? Okay? So this has been described as bleeding edge technology because it's extremely risky, extremely expensive, and you never know what other problems there are. Now, we learn from Linus too. Okay, do you want a pressurized carbon dioxide pipe running in your backyard? It may comply with all the industrial standards, safety standards, etc. But we all know that public opinion now also weighs in. All right, I'm getting close to the end. I talked about transparency versus compliance. I think this is very important. This is the big decision that's going to come up in the upcoming COP decisions in the 2015 agreement. Are we going to have a compliance mechanism, or are we going to have a transparency mechanism? We really want a transparency mechanism for developing countries because we want to focus on the activities that we're undertaking. We don't want to have to worry about achieving a target. We want to worry about implementing emissions reductions and adaptation. But at the same time, we cannot let developed countries off the hook and loosen the rules for them. Now, I want to go back to one of the ideas that I talked about very earlier, that is how the narrative is being shaped. And in this case, being shaped in the science. This is a diagram from the Working Group 3 of the 5th Assessment Report of the IPCC, the Governmental Plan on Climate Change. You might know that Working Group 3 deals with mitigation. All right? Down here you have emissions from bunker fuels, aviation and shipping, low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and high-income countries. Okay? This is the way the graph appeared in the underlying document and was proposed to us in the summary for policymakers. Now, what does this graph, oops, sorry, wrong button. What does this graph tell us? First of all, emissions from international travel, low but growing. 1970, 1990, 2010. It also tells us that low-income countries' emissions are primarily from land use. You see, that's the green stuff. Deforestation and land use. Okay? But when we get to lower middle-income countries, we see that the emissions begin to come from energy. All right? But if we jump over to the developed countries, the take-home message is that high-income countries, the emissions are stabilizing. Not much more emissions coming from the emissions are not growing that much. All right? But, and here is the critical part. Upper middle-income countries grew the fastest. They are comparable to high-income countries, and the biggest growth is in emissions and industry. Okay? What is the take-home message from this graph? Well, this graph says that the middle-income countries are the ones who are going to be under a regime similar to the developed countries. Alright? What don't they tell you? Well, what they're not telling you is, in this group, of course, is India and China. But in 1970, India and China were both in this group. Guess what? They're not here in 1970. They're not. They're only here. They're already here. Okay? In 1990, China was already here, but India was still here in the lower middle income group. That's not stated. Okay? Also hidden is how many countries make up each of these groups comparatively. And then ultimately, how would this look if it were on a per capita basis rather than a total basis? Alright? So on the basis of all these arguments, developing countries fought to have this graph redrawn, or drawn in many forms, or drawn from different viewpoints. Alright? But the lead author, the chairman of the group, said no, either this or we pull it out. So we pulled it out. Okay? So the science is being co-opted because the bulk of scientists are from developed countries. Alright? And that is shaping the climate narrative moving forward. What do we need? We need more young scientists to publish in local journals, doesn't matter, but then these findings For example, the cost of adaptation. We don't have data, so we cannot publish it. So it doesn't come into this discussion. We need that kind of data to go in and have a good discussion. Okay? And that's all I have for you. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take your questions. You can read this yourself.